Throughout World War II, there were many women who worked inside of the concentration camps. Some were attracted to work at sites such as Bergen-Belsen, Auschwitz or Buchenwald for better pay and the chance of promotion, and they left jobs as hairdressers, teachers and shop workers to become brutal monsters. Inside of youth groups such as the League of German Maidens, young women became savages, and they were taught how to instigate a reign of brutality and terror over others. At the end of the war, the Allies were disgusted and shocked how young women could inflict such suffering inside the concentration camps. Some women were sent to the gallows for their crimes, with experienced hangmen bringing their lives to an end. In this documentary, we look at 5 female concentration camp guards who were executed for their crimes. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Maria Mandel was born in Austria in January 1912. She would become an active member in the Nazi movement within Austria, which at the time was banned. However, following the annexation of Austria, she joined the SS. Being a female member of the group, she would quickly find employment within the regime as a concentration camp guard. She would begin her employment at Lichtenberg, one of the earliest Nazi concentration camps in Saxony. She would work alongside 50 other SS women. Initially, the camp held male prisoners. However, between 1937 and 1939, it would house females. Many of the male prisoners who went before, political prisoners, were tortured and beaten to death by the SS guards. This savagery would continue as the prison changed to being a women's camp. Many women were beaten to death, and 2 women who tried to escape were ripped to pieces by the dogs on the orders of the camp's commandant. Maria would begin working here in October 1938, and the following year there was further change. Along with the guards and prisoners, Maria Mandel was sent to Ravensbrück concentration camp near to Berlin. This camp had just been set up, and she began to work here as a supervisor on the first day it opened. Ravensbrück was a camp specifically for women, and as the Nazis would conquer more land and territory, the numbers inside the camp would grow. Maria Mandel, from the start of her work as a guard, gained a horrific reputation for immense cruelty. Heinrich Himmler would visit in 1940, and he allowed the guards to use punishment such as flogging. Mandel would often be the one who would dish out the brutal floggings and whippings. This could have been as few as 10 to 25 lashes for less serious offences. However, some prisoners were lashed up to 75 times. This was so barbaric that the lashes had to be even given in instalments, as death was a distinct possibility. Mandel was so obsessed with inflicting pain that many of the prisoners had to be revived for their punishment to continue, losing consciousness, such was the pain. Bodies would become blue with bruises, and many were afflicted for life. Maria impressed her superiors and was promoted in April 1942, becoming the head supervisor of Auschwitz-Birkenau. Birkenau was the extermination camp of the Auschwitz complex, and during the Holocaust and the Final Solution, it was used as the main centre for killing Jews and other minorities, which went against the Nazis' racial laws. She replaced Johanna Langerfeld as the commander of the women's camp, who had previously fallen out with Rudolf Höss. Mandel's intelligence and devotion to the Nazi cause is what led to her promotion. She would preside over the women's camp with terror, and would earn the nickname the Beast. The brutal and horrific punishments and beatings would continue. She would also take part in the selections, playing God with the lives of the prisoners inside Auschwitz. Jews who were not fit enough to work would have been sent straight to the gas chambers in these selections, and it would be Mandel who would decide this. From selection to death would be a mere matter of minutes, and in this way she sent dozens of thousands to their deaths. Many of the female prisoners chosen by Mandel would also have to submit to barbaric, degrading, and often deadly medical experiments carried out by SS doctors such as Josef Mengele. Some of the women selected by Maria would become the test subjects for these experiments. After the war, at her trial, the court would hear of many of these horrific experiments. Testimonies would tell how hundreds of women had been sterilised by X-rays and forcibly had their ovaries removed for further examination before they were sent to their death inside the gas chambers. It would also be told how children were sometimes just left to freeze to death in the winter at the camp, and also how Mandel forced thousands of women to stand to attention in their bare feet in the snow. These women collapsed in the freezing temperature and also suffered from hypothermia. They were then ordered to run back to the barracks, and those who could not do so were sent to their deaths. When hearing this, Mandel responded at trial that she had always cared for the prisoners' well-being. Other accounts would tell how she would have a number of liaisons with large groups at her furnished villa near to Auschwitz. These parties were huge episodes of debauchery and often occurred when Mandel wanted to celebrate after administering torture. Mandel would take part in selections for over 2 years, and it's estimated that 500,000 women and children were sent to their deaths by Mandel's actions in Auschwitz. She would also establish within the camp an orchestra. She was a fan of music, and instead of cleaning toilets and completing horrendous hard labour, a privileged group of women were forced to perform in an orchestra. This consisted of a couple of violins, cello, guitars, accordions and other instruments. The orchestra was even conducted, and they played marches whilst women arrived at the camp. It was said that the women who came back from work exhausted had to march in time to the music. Music was ordered for all occasions, for the addresses of the camp commanders, for the transports, and whenever anyone was hanged. As Auschwitz was liberated by the Red Army, Maria Mandel was nowhere to be found. She had left the camp in late 1944, being assigned to a subcamp of Dachau. With the Allies and the Red Army liberating different camps, exposing the horrors of the Nazi regime, Mandel fled into the mountains of southern Bavaria. She was arrested on the 10th of August 1945 by the US Army and was interrogated. During this process it was found that she was very intelligent and was devoted to her work in the mass extermination of the Jews. She was held at Dachau prison for a period of time and was then handed over to the Polish People's Republic before being tried in the Auschwitz trials. When hearing the testimonies from the sufferers of Mandel's cruelty, she would sit with her head bent. Along with a number of other guards, she was found guilty of the horrendous crimes she had committed within Auschwitz and was sentenced to death as a war criminal. Whilst awaiting her execution, it was said that she did ask for forgiveness for her crimes. On the 28th of January 1948, inside Krakow prison, which had been one of the worst Nazi prisons in Poland, along with 20 other condemned, Maria Mandel was hanged. She was the first of the group to be executed, being female. At 7:09 a.m, the hangings would commence inside of the execution chamber. Maria, along with 4 male prisoners, was made to climb a simple step, then they had the noose placed around their neck. The step was then removed, and the former Auschwitz guard was slowly strangled to death. It was reported that it took 15 minutes for all of the first group, including Maria Mandel, to be certified dead within. Maria Mandel was someone who was familiar with the gallows and executions, and it was fitting that her end would come with the hangman's noose. She was an incredibly brutal and barbaric woman, and would oversee the deaths of almost 500,000 people within Auschwitz. This is a sadistic figure, considering she had a role in sending 500,000 people to their deaths within the gas chambers. She certainly got what was coming to her, and her execution was a justified one. Elisabeth Becker was born on the 20th of July 1923, and she was born in Nutteich in Danzig. Her family were German, and as the Nazis came to power, she would then join the League of German Girls. This was the girls' wing of the Nazi Party, and it was the only female youth organisation in Nazi Germany. The membership for young women was compulsory, and at its height there were over 4.5 million members. The BDM, as it was known, would indoctrinate and brainwash girls into Nazi beliefs and systems, and they would also train them for their roles in German society as wives, mothers and housewives. This is what Hitler wanted, women to have as many children for his Reich and Empire as possible, who would then be loyal to the dictator and his party. The girls would be forced to learn Nazi songs and sing them. They were also forced to conduct physical education, including track and field. They would also take part in huge sports days. The League of German Girls would even try to discourage the girls to ignore any rebellion against their parents, and they wanted them to be more loyal to the Nazis than their own family. Girls also were required to conduct a year of land service, where they would work on farms, and also in other roles to show their loyalty to the Nazis. During the outbreak of the Second World War, the girls were told that the invasion of Poland was justified to punish those people who were considered subhuman. The propaganda they were told was ramped up, and because of this a number of girls who were part of the group would want to pursue a career inside of the Nazi Party's industries, such as the SS and inside of the concentration camps. One example of this was Irma Grese, who would be known as a beautiful beast, and her involvement in the League of German Girls would cause her father to throw her out of the family home, but she would become more loyal to Hitler than her own family. She later joined the concentration camp labour force and became a notorious guard. Other girls would volunteer for the German war effort as nurses and aides inside hospitals, and some even served as anti-aircraft defenders, working as flak helpers and searchlight operators. Elisabeth Becker, as mentioned, would join this group at the age of 13, where she was very impressionable, and she would become a devoted Nazi, it is believed. It's likely her family would also be Nazis, but in 1938, when she was just 15, she would go and work as a conductor on the tramways in Danzig, her hometown. In 1940, she was also then employed in different firms and businesses, and she also worked as an agriculture assistant. All of her roles and jobs were inside of her hometown of Danzig, and she did not stray too far from home and from family life. But then as the war turned against the Nazis and the Germans, and with a shortage of local men to work inside of the concentration camps, the SS placed adverts around local towns and cities to appeal to German women to train as concentration camp guards. Many women inside of Danzig answered the call, and one of these was Elisabeth Becker. She may have actually been called up for service too, being requested to work inside of the camps, and she may have also had little choice. However, where she would work would be Stutthof. Stutthof concentration camp was created following the invasion of Poland, and it was a place where many Polish people would be housed inside of following the invasion. It became a concentration camp in 1942, and the original camp was surrounded by barbed wire, and it had 8 barracks filled with inmates. But then it was enlarged heavily, and a new site containing 30 new barrack buildings was made, and also a crematoria and a gas chamber was added in 1943. This was to make sure that the execution of prisoners could take place as efficiently and as quickly as possible. 150 people at a time could be held inside of the gas chamber at the site. The camp staff was made up of many men, but also a number of women who worked there. Women such as Irma Grese, Hertha Botha, and Wanda Barkmann would become notorious for their treatment of inmates at Stutthof. But as time went on, there were huge transports of women and men who were sent from camps such as Auschwitz. The conditions there were very harsh, and dozens of thousands of people succumbed to starvation and the disease epidemics that were sweeping through the site. Executions were also carried out at Stutthof, and many dozens of prisoners were shot at the site, with thousands being slaughtered also inside of the gas chamber. But Stutthof's inmates would also suffer at the hands of the medical staff, who would inject sick inmates with phenol, killing them, and the guards would also violently beat prisoners to death. The forced labour that the inmates were made to conduct was also horrific, and the prisoners were given insufficient rations for the roles they were doing. Elisabeth Becker would inside of Stutthof become known for being a brutal guard, and despite being in her early 20s, many women who were guarded by her would not even want to look at her in the eyes. She was a woman who was an ardent Nazi, and in particular involved in the selections of inmates. During this process, there would be doctors and guards who would look for the weakest inmates, and those who were then selected were quickly transported to the gas chambers, where they were killed. Elisabeth was involved in this every single day, and her actions led to many women and children being sent to their deaths, and she was deciding who would live and who would die every single day. Many female guards were brought to trials at the end of the Second World War, and they would be condemned due to their actions in the selections. But Becker continued to work at Stutthof as a guard until she ran away and fled on the 15th of January 1945. She was concerned that she may fall into the hands of the enemies, but some guards who accompanied prisoners on death marches would slaughter the former inmates. Becker had only been at Stutthof for around 4 months, and she returned home in January 1945. But 3 months later she was then arrested by the Polish police, and she was then placed in prison to await her trial. She was a defendant in the first Stutthof trial in Danzig, and this sought to punish the guards who worked at the site. Along with Elisabeth Becker, there were 5 other women, including Wanda Barkmann, who was brought in front of a judge. Many witnesses came forward with their testimony, and they named Elisabeth as someone who exhibited brutality in front of other inmates, and she was linked to the selections of prisoners who went to their deaths in the gas chambers. Elisabeth Becker was then sentenced to death, and she would at her trial confess that she selected at least 30 women to be sent to the gas chambers and be killed. Following her death sentence, Elisabeth Becker then sent a number of letters of appeal to the Polish president for clemency, and the court at the time, on review, considered reducing her death sentence to 15 years imprisonment, as her actions were considered not as severe as other women, such as Gerda Steinhoff and Jenny Barkmann. However, Elisabeth Becker had also been at the camp for the shortest amount of time, but the Polish president would not issue a pardon, and along with the other condemned guards, Elisabeth Becker was brought in front of a huge crowd for her execution on the 4th of July 1946. Biskupia Gorka was the location of the executions of the guards of Stutthof. This was a huge hill, and on this were a number of gallows, huge wooden execution structures, where the guards would be hanged on. On the hill were also 200,000 people who were there to witness the proceedings. Elisabeth Becker was brought out with the other guards, and she was then told to climb on top of a truck, in which many executioners and officials were stood on. One of these then read out the death sentence, and the preparations were made as the truck was backed up under the gallows. A rope and a noose was placed around the gallows, then an executioner helped Elisabeth onto a step, then the noose was placed around her neck. All the final checks took place, and after this, the truck drove off and Elisabeth was left on the scaffold and on the gallows, and within minutes she was executed and declared dead, high above the huge crowd. Elisabeth Becker, at the day of her death, was just 22, but she was a woman who had exhibited much cruelty and brutality onto people who were suffering. She was a woman who was responsible for the deaths of at least 30 women, and she was spotted selecting many people to go to their deaths in the gas chambers. Despite the calls for clemency, she was considered a brutal guard who was brainwashed by the Nazis through her education and the youth groups she was forced to join. However, she was a war criminal at the end of the day, and her actions contributed to the executions of others, and this is why the court in Poland believes she deserved to die. 200,000 people saw her execution that day on the hill in Danzig and Gdansk. Irma Grese was born on the 7th of October 1923 inside of a small village named Reschen. It was a very rural upbringing for her, and she was raised around 50 miles north of Berlin. Her father, Alfred, was a farmer, and her mother took her own life in 1932 when she was 9 years old, and it was believed the marriage problems that she had with her husband may have led to this. But this left Irma and her 4 siblings without a mother, but her father was considered a man who regularly visited church, but he was very strict and stern with his children, and he often beat them. But he was a man who had a lot of bad feelings towards the Nazis and the rise of Hitler, and he banned his daughters from joining the League of German Girls, the Nazi youth group for young women, where they were taught how to be a housewife and a mother. But Irma and her sister Helene joined the group against her father's wishes, and she became brainwashed by the Nazis, and she indulged in many of their policies. Irma began her indoctrination at the age of 10 when Hitler came into power, and her father had no choice over this, as at the time Nazi education was introduced in all elementary schools. Irma would become an ardent Nazi even at a young age, and at the age of 14 she left school after leaving home. She then worked as a farmhand for 6 months, before working in Luschen, in a shop as a retail sales clerk. She may have left home due to the rift which was opening up between her and her father, as he was disgusted by Irma's influence inside of the Nazi party, and how she was beginning to venerate Hitler. Irma, though, was a girl who was not considered the most violent at a young age, and she would often run away from fights and not get involved in them. But at some point she changed completely. In 1939 she went to study nursing, but she went to do this at the Hohenlyschen Hospital, a place where SS members would go to convalesce, around 20 miles from her hometown. This was where many top-ranking Nazis would go to be treated, and she trained, it's believed, under Karl Gebhardt, who would during the Second World War be known as a disgusting and evil doctor who performed shocking medical experimentation. He too would later be executed for his crimes, but it's believed that Irma may have been party to some of these experiments, and may have watched as she tried to become a nurse. Whilst here it's likely she became further indoctrinated with the SS also, but she apparently was not good enough to be a nurse, and it was said she was best fit for other lines of work. She was around 17 at the time, but Irma then spoke to one of Gebhardt's friends at Ravensbrück, an all-female concentration camp. She went here for work in April 1941 and was told to come back in 6 months when she was 18. In the meantime, she worked at a dairy farm and as a machinist, but she then went back to Ravensbrück and she joined the SS as an SS Aufseherinnen, or a female concentration camp guard. Women were asked to work in this line of employment from all over Germany, and around 2,500 would serve during the Second World War. Irma had to pass a number of exams, and she was also asked questions to ensure she was a Nazi and a strong one who knew about the party and the race laws. She then was hired to train as a concentration camp guard, and she went through 3 weeks of hard and difficult training. On one of her first days, she actually apologised to a prisoner who stepped out in front of her, and this was deemed not good enough, and she was then told how to brutally deal with inmates and how to not be polite to them. She around this time began to have relations with the SS male officers at the camp, and it was said that it appeared that all Aufseherinnens, married or unmarried, had one or more constant SS lovers. She would have indulged in the drinking bouts and parties that the SS had in the evening, but after 3 weeks she was trained. She then went to participate in many inmate beatings at Ravensbrück, and each month she was making 54 Reichsmarks in salary. She was trained by other sadists, but at the age of 19 it was time for her to move on. She received orders that she was going to be transferred to Auschwitz-Birkenau, near to Krakow. Before this move she went home, and Irma visited her father, and whilst wearing her full SS uniform, she had a huge argument with him. Her father allegedly struck her during this, and he then told her never to come home. But when she got to Auschwitz, Irma Grese was assigned to the women's camp at Birkenau, and this was the main extermination part of the site where thousands were killed in the gas chambers. She had a number of duties there, including commanding the gardening squad, working on the telephones, and even being in control of the mail. She then in May 1944 became an Oberaufseherin, and she was given the task of commanding over 30,000 female prisoners in Birkenau's B-22C camp. She then in this role became infamous, and she would wear heavy boots and would carry her pistol and whip at all times. Grese became known as a beautiful beast, or the blonde angel of hell, and she often wore expensive perfumes and tormented the women on a daily basis. One former doctor of Auschwitz described her as the most beautiful woman I've ever seen. Her face has an angelic clarity, and her blue eyes were the liveliest and most innocent eyes imaginable. Another said, it defied belief that such a pretty girl could be so cruel. When she walked through the camp with a whip in her hand, she was surrounded by a cloud of choice perfume. Grese often stole valuables and clothing from the prisoners inside Auschwitz, but she would use her weapons to kill. She would use her whip to attack the women, and sometimes these injuries led to infections, which women would suffer. Doctors would then be forced to operate on the women with dirty equipment and no anaesthetics. She would then witness these operations, and it was said, Irma Grese invariably arrived to watch the operation, kicking the victim if her screams interfered with her pleasure, and giving her completely the spasms which shook her entire body and made saliva run down the corner of her mouth. She was also known for shooting inmates at will whenever she liked it. But she also had dogs that she would use to strike fear into prisoners' hearts. During one incident, she was on a bicycle with her dog at the side of her, and any prisoner who could not keep up during a 16-kilometre walk to work was attacked by the canine. One witness of her actions involving the dog said, we were loading the lorries. Before noon we had an unexpected visitor, Aufseherin Irma, with her 2 leashed dogs. Frau Aufseherin Irma, blonde, with an angel face and snake eyes, the camp's chief torturer. We were very careful not to attract her attention. We pushed and pushed. It seemed to take an eternity to roll the car over the hill. The next team was unable to coordinate its efforts. They were completely unnerved by our visitor. They hesitated and lost control of their wagon. It swayed, bowled down the hill, and capsized, scattering stone over the whole area. The prisoners were completely broken in spirit. Aufseherin Irma set the 2 dogs on them. The girls tried to escape their fangs, but the trained killers easily overtook them. One grabbed a Polish woman which slipped on a rock. The other fell upon a Russian girl. At Irma's orders, the Capo underlings beat and kicked the girls, still untouched by the dogs. The Capo wrote down the numbers of the delinquent team. The dogs were tearing at the girls' bodies, Irma came closer to observe what they were doing. Her eyes were bloodshot. The sight of the blood seemed to intoxicate her. She panted. We stood in a trance, as if at a gladiatorial combat. Irma Grese was also involved in the selection processes, and she would regularly decide with doctors such as Josef Mengele who would live and who would die. She even, it's believed, had an affair with Mengele, as well as other men and women, including female prisoners, and when she got bored of them she would send them to their deaths. Grese did fall pregnant, and she forced the inmate doctor to perform a termination on her, and she even supplied the instruments required, and the doctor did perform this procedure. She did fall in love with an SS man though, Franz Wolfgang Haxinger, who was the chief engineer of Auschwitz I's construction element, and the pair would meet up in the evenings. But as the Second World War turned against the Germans, Irma Grese's work at Auschwitz came to an end, as the camp was evacuated, with the Red Army on the horizon. She was transferred to Ravensbrück briefly on the 18th of January 1945, but then in March 1945 she arrived at Bergen-Belsen. Belsen was a site in complete breakdown, as huge numbers of inmates were evacuated there, and she was reunited with many of her former colleagues of Auschwitz, such as Josef Kramer. Whilst at Belsen, Irma Grese continued to be brutal, and she would force inmates to stand or kneel for long periods of time, and at roll call they had to hold rocks above their heads. They were forced to stand in the cold, and if someone struggled she would beat them with her truncheon. Even as the Allies were close by to liberating Belsen, she was still brutalising inmates. Irma Grese remained at the camp as the Allies seized control, and she was there to allegedly maintain law and order. She had the chance to run, but decided against it. She was not immediately arrested and was forced to help bury the over 10,000 corpses that were lying around. She was then arrested on the 17th of April 1945, and many heard about her evil actions, and she was temporarily imprisoned in a Wehrmacht tank training academy nearby. She said, "It was our duty to exterminate antisocial elements so that Germany's future would be assured." Further interrogation went on, and she was then a few months later indicted with others on charges of execution, murder, ill-treatment and barbarism at Belsen and Auschwitz. She was brought to the Belsen trials, and during the trial it was said she was more bothered by her appearance than the charges that were brought against her. Throughout the trial she remained calm, and she remained unemotional when the evidence was put forward. Witnesses described seeing Irma Grese shooting prisoners at point-blank range, and one said she was beaten by Grese, and that some were even beaten to death. When the trial came to an end, Irma Grese was sentenced to death alongside two other women, Elisabeth Volkenrath and Johanna Bormann. She was taken from her cell, and following this Grese was known to be crying. She was then sent to Hamelin prison to await her execution, and it was Albert Pierpoint who would take her life. On the 13th of December 1945, Grese was to face a hangman, and she was the second to die that day, as Elisabeth Volkenrath was to die first. It was said of her execution, "We climbed the stairs to the cells where the condemned were waiting. A German officer at the door leading to the corridor flung open the door, and we fired past the row of faces and into the execution chamber. The officers stood at attention. Brigadier Patton Walsh stood with his wristwatch raised. He gave me the signal, and a sigh of released breath was audible in the chamber. I walked into the corridor. Irma Grese, I called. The German guards quickly closed all grills on 12 of the inspection holes and opened one door. Irma Grese stepped out. The cell was far too small for me to go inside. I had to pinion her in the corridor. Follow me, I said in English, and O'Neill repeated the order in German. At 9:34 a.m, she walked into the execution chamber, gazed at a moment for the officials standing round it, then walked into the centre of the trap, where I had made a chalk mark. She stood on this mark very firmly, and as I placed the white cap over her head, she said in her languid voice, "Schnell." The drop crashed down, and the doctor followed me into the pit and pronounced her dead. After 20 minutes, her body was taken down and placed in a coffin, ready for burial. Irma Grese was one of the most notorious war criminals of the Second World War, and she was known for being a murderer and a brutal guard who was too happy to beat people with her whip and other weapons. She took many lives with her pistol and was sentenced to death for her crimes. Jenny Barkmann was born on the 30th of May 1922 in Hamburg, within the Weimar Republic. Very little is known about her early life, and it's assumed that in fact she had a rather normal childhood and upbringing attending school. It's also assumed that she had a rather normal life within Hamburg, as Hitler seized control of Germany. However, at some point she decided to transition into a rather brutal and sadistic line of work. In 1944, as the Second World War was turning against the Nazis, Jenny Barkmann joined Stutthof concentration camp, and she became an Aufseherin, a female guard. Now, of 55,000 guards who worked within the concentration camps, 3,700 of them were women. The first female guards arrived at Auschwitz and Majdanek from Ravensbrück in 1942. Ravensbrück at the time was the main female concentration camp of the Holocaust. However, the Nazis in 1943 began to conscript women into the concentration camp system because at the time there was a shortage of guards. Women became Aufseherins, overseers or attendants, and they were generally from the lower or middle classes. The Nazis weren't picky and took any woman without any relevant work experience, and many came from completely different lines of work, for example retired teachers or hairdressers. Volunteers were recruited via newspaper advertisements, and these asked women to show their love for the Third Reich and to join the SS retinue for women. Some women were alternatively conscripted into the camps, and there was even enrolment from the League of German Girls, a youth group which girls joined. Jenny Barkmann arrived at Stutthof concentration camp in 1944. It was a camp established by the Nazis in a marsh area east of the city of Danzig. Following the invasion of Poland, the camp was set up and it was initially used as a place to house Polish prisoners, and it was the first camp set up outside the borders of Germany. Interestingly, it was also the last camp liberated by the Allies. However, inside Stutthof's gates and walls, much of the same horrors of the Holocaust occurred. It's estimated that around 65,000 prisoners died within Stutthof and the subcamps due to murder, starvation, outbreaks of disease and illness, being forced to work incredibly hard, a lack of medical supervision, and also being forced on death marches. Over 110,000 people were deported to the camp, and it's estimated that around 28,000 Jews were executed inside. A number of prisoners who found themselves there came from many different countries, and many of the prisoners were members of the Polish underground. The conditions were in particular horrendous, with thousands of prisoners dying of disease and starvation. There were many typhus epidemics that swept across the camps, and the SS guards judged those who were weak or sick and sent them straight into the gas chambers within the camp. Executions began there in January 1940, and the gassings began using Zyklon B in 1944, and prisoners inside Stutthof were often clubbed and beaten to death or even drowned in mud, such were the horrific conditions. There was also lots of forced labour, and many German companies utilised inmates to work in their workshops and factories. There was even an allegation at Stutthof that corpses from the camp were used in creating soap. Now Jenny Barkmann was transferred across to Stutthof in 1944, and the guards were expected to be ruthless with their treatment of the prisoners. However, within Stutthof, she became known for her awful cruelty and barbarism. She regularly brutalised prisoners, often to death. Barkmann got stuck into her work at the camp and often beat victims to death to strike fear into the hearts of other inmates. She was also regularly involved in the selection processes at the camp, selecting those who were not fit enough to go to work and sending them straight to their deaths within the gas chambers. She sent many women and children straight to their deaths, and for her brutality she became known as a beautiful spectre. Her actions inside the concentration camps were only too familiar with guards, and as the Second World War came to an end, Barkmann tried to flee to escape her fate. She hid in Gdansk, which at the time was besieged, and she decided to go under a false name to try and become undetected and escape. However, in May 1945, she was identified and finally arrested. Now, along with other criminals and guards who worked at Stutthof, she was placed on trial in 1946. Poland held 4 trials overall for the former guards who worked there, and they were charged with war crimes and crimes against humanity. The first trial, held in Gdansk, saw Barkmann along with 12 other defendants, including 6 female guards, face their fate in evidence. Jenny Barkmann throughout her trial did not show any remorse. It was said during her imprisonment that she was mostly concerned with her appearance, wearing a different hairstyle for each day of the trial, and she allegedly even flirted with the prison guards. It was also noted how throughout the trial she giggled and laughed repeatedly and was more bothered with her hair. Along with 10 other defendants, Jenny Barkmann was sentenced to death for her crimes of the Holocaust, and she was to be executed by hanging. On the 4th of July 1946, Soviet officials working in occupied Poland led the condemned out of their prison cells and took them to the Biskupa Gorka Hill near to Gdansk. A huge crowd had gathered of around 200,000 to see the execution of the condemned, including Barkmann. She wore a simple dress, and at around 5 p.m. she was stood under the gallows. Then Barkmann was placed onto a truck, and her hands were tied around her back and her ankles also tied together. The hangman then placed the noose around her neck, and final preparations were made for her execution. She stood there facing the huge crowds, and then suddenly the truck drove away. Jenny Barkmann had nothing to stand on, and because of this she was left hanging in front of the crowd. She was there dangling, and she twitched her hands and feet together and lost one shoe as she struggled for breath. She then turned limp and was one of the first of those executed before the other condemned were executed that day. Jenny Barkmann was only just 24 years old when she was executed. In what was very common during the Holocaust, many of the SS guards, in particular the women, were very young when they committed the horrendous crimes that they became infamous for at the concentration camps. It was clear that they were brainwashed by the ways of Hitler, and they must have believed within the camps they were doing the right thing, inflicting torture and barbarism onto the innocent prisoners. Born Elisabeth Merlau, she was the daughter of a forest worker, and Elisabeth was part of a large family, having a number of siblings. After she finished school, she worked as a nanny and a cook from 1933 to May 1938, and then afterwards she became a hairdresser. Before the Second World War occurred, she became inspired with the politics of the Nazi Party and became ingrained with the policies outlined by Adolf Hitler. She signed up for the SS retinue at the start of October 1941 and worked as an overseer initially at Ravensbrück concentration camp. Ravensbrück was a camp strictly for female prisoners that was opened by the Nazis, and she worked under Dorothea Binz. She was trained to be an Aufseherin, and she had to keep an eye on the prisoners to ensure that no one escaped. In March 1942, Elisabeth Volkenrath applied for a transfer from Ravensbrück to Auschwitz, the huge extermination and labour complex in which the final solution was implemented within. It was planned for Auschwitz to be one of the main extermination camps, responsible for massacring as many people as the Nazis required. Volkenrath became a guard in the prisoner's tailor shop inside of the camp, and then after, in August 1942, she was transferred to the women's area at Auschwitz-Birkenau. Birkenau was the main extermination element of Auschwitz, but shortly after, she was taken ill. Elisabeth Volkenrath was stricken down with a case of typhus and ended up in hospital. After this, she took office inside the parcel post in Birkenau from the end of December 1942. Here she monitored up to 30 prisoners, and she would inspect different packages coming into the camp. She ordered the prisoners to inspect the packages that were coming in, many from the Red Cross, and then the goods inside these would be distributed. Volkenrath was also tasked with handing out bread inside of the camp. She remained at Auschwitz-Birkenau until September 1944, and was then transferred back to Auschwitz I, becoming the camp leader of the women's area. She was promoted to the superintendent of the women's camp, and remained in this position until Auschwitz was evacuated. In terms of what Elisabeth Volkenrath did at Auschwitz and other camps, she was accused of a number of despicable actions. She was accused at her trial of taking part in the selection processes. This is where prisoners would arrive at the camp by train, and those who were simply not fit enough to work would be sent straight to their deaths inside of the gas chambers. Volkenrath was accused of choosing those inmates to be killed immediately, but she would deny this like so many SS guards would at trial. She was also accused of helping to load prisoners onto transports and lorries, which would take them straight to the gas chambers after their fates had been decided. She did claim that she did not know where the lorries were heading. The most shocking claims about Elisabeth Volkenrath relate to her inhumane and cruel treatment of prisoners while she worked in the women's section of Auschwitz. It was said by a number of witnesses that she had a habit of beating women, and she admitted that she did slap the faces of many women whilst working as a guard. A lady, Vera Fischer, stated that she was once beaten so severely by Volkenrath that she was placed in hospital for 3 weeks. It was also claimed that on around 80 occasions she was witnessed beating women prisoners until they were unconscious, and that armed with a rubber truncheon she even beat many women to death. Helene Herkovitz stated in evidence against Volkenrath that she was questioned about a ring and a locket she was wearing, and after this she was forced to run behind a bicycle to the SS headquarters where Volkenrath was. There she beat her with a rubber truncheon, and she was placed in a cellar and given bread and water every 3 days. She was then forced to work in the toilets, where she caught typhus and almost died. The accusations continued, with Volkenrath accused of throwing an old woman down a flight of stairs near to the workshop, where the old lady then died immediately. Also, she took food and water away from prisoners, as well as other supplies, leaving them with very little to survive on. Volkenrath also imposed making sport, where prisoners were forced to take part in grueling exercises in a group form of punishment, and sometimes these punishments were so severe that prisoners died from exhaustion. Volkenrath, in terms of her conduct, was also later accused of striking women so hard that they would be knocked down to the ground and would be out cold. It was stated that she once caught a girl who was sick taking some vegetables, and Volkenrath made her kneel down and hold the stolen goods above her head for 4 hours, until she could no longer hold her arms up. After this she took her rubber truncheon to her and knocked the poor girl unconscious, and it was instructed that no one could help her until nightfall. She was known for being a brutal and savage guard who would happily beat prisoners unconscious and sometimes even to death, imposing a reign of terror onto those poor people inside of the camps. After Auschwitz was evacuated, Elisabeth Volkenrath was sent to Bergen-Belsen concentration camp on the 5th of February 1945, and she worked under the Beast of Belsen, Camp Commandant Josef Kramer. She stated that once again she fell ill from typhus after a few days of arriving at Belsen, and it's clear that there was a rife typhus epidemic sweeping the camp. The state of Belsen at this time in the war was shocking, with much hunger and desperation all around. On the 15th of April 1945, Bergen-Belsen was liberated by the British. As they entered the camp they found around 10,000 corpses and around 60,000 prisoners clinging to life. Also at the camp there were a number of guards who had stayed there rather than flee, and one of these was Elisabeth Volkenrath. She was taken to the cellar prison shortly after she was forced by the British to remove all of the corpses and bury them in mass graves. Whilst in prison she was interrogated, and through prisoner testimonies it was clear what a brutal and barbaric woman she clearly was. Prisoners from Belsen and Auschwitz told of her beatings and her thirst for violence at such a young age. She was then placed on trial at the Belsen trial, which began on September 17, 1945 at Lerneberg. She was charged with crimes committed at Auschwitz and Belsen, and chose to plead not guilty. Volkenrath did admit that she attended selections at Auschwitz, but denied participating, and also said how she did not know about the gas chambers. She admitted to slapping inmates, and stated that the mistreatment of prisoners was a lie. Volkenrath even went as far to say that she had been punished in the fact she had to live like the prisoners. Along with 2 other women and a host of other males such as Josef Kramer, Elisabeth Volkenrath was sentenced to death for her crimes. On the 13th of December 1945, at Hamelin prison, she was taken out of her cell to the execution chamber. Her execution was to be performed by British executioner Albert Pierpoint using the long drop method on a specially built scaffold. Pierpoint and his assistant met previously with all of the condemned to calculate their height, weight and the subsequent drop needed to snap their necks and kill them. Pierpoint on simultaneous gallows performed the execution of those condemned during the Belsen trials. However, the women condemned would go first. The first of the women to die was Volkenrath. She was brought into the chamber and taken up the stairs to the gallows. At 9:34 a.m, she was placed over a trap door in which Pierpoint had written a chalk X on the ground. A cap was placed over her head, as was a noose, and in seconds the death of Elisabeth Volkenrath occurred, with her neck snapping instantly. She was then declared dead, and her remains were cremated. What is shocking about Elisabeth Volkenrath is the immense thirst for brutality she had at such a young age. When she was taken to the gallows, she was merely just a 26-year-old woman. When she committed many of her crimes in Auschwitz, she would have been younger, and she first worked in a concentration camp at the age of 22. It seems that despite volunteering, she had a real passion for inflicting barbaric punishment onto prisoners, and she seemed like a woman desperate to wield her power over the innocent suffering.